So my name is Brian Goldstein. I'm Executive Director of Energy Independence Now. As we were introduced, we are the only environmental nonprofit that I know of in the world that just focuses on hydrogen. Our background initially was in the California market. Our organization is about 20 years old. We were founded by a gentleman named Terry Tamminen, who went on to become the Secretary of Cal EPA and Cabinet Secretary under Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. I will be presenting a keynote at 11, and I'll dive a little more into the work that we do, but in the sake of time, I'd like to get started with the panel here. So maybe we could take a couple of minutes, and I think you're all familiar with these speakers. They've all spoken. Andrew and Mary Rose gave keynotes this morning, so I think we'll start here with Ellen to actually provide a little more background to build on the keynote she presented last night. And let's just go ahead and dive in.
Oh, okay. Good morning. My name is Ellen Stechel, and as said, I co-direct the ASU Lightworks initiative, which is a campus-wide initiative in light-inspired research for energy and sustainability. But I spent most of my career at a Department of Energy, National Security Laboratories, so energy security and geopolitics is always front and center. And I also spent part of my career at an auto industry, and they're not evil. so that also shaped my thinking. The problem, the way as we see it, is very simple in concept at least, and that's that the carbon cycle is out of balance. And that means there's more sources than sinks. And even if we accept 450 ppm in the atmosphere, which is going to do a lot of damage already, the proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal way exceed the budget by 3 to 4x. So, and that says we have to, how did it say, stop the burning, keep the turbines chirping? Maybe. So the solution, while the problem is simple in concept, the solution is also simple on the surface. Stop burning the fossil fuels, stop burning the hydrocarbons is easy to say. But how fast can we realistically turn that system off without serious consequences? Leave that as a question. I'm not going to answer it. I don't think any of us have good answers to that yet. But that would argue that we need bridges that smoothly take us from the old to the new. Creative destruction without dislocations. Taking advantage of trillions of dollars of infrastructure and centuries of know-how. We can't just start over. So one of the biggest differences in the fossil-based energy and renewable primary energy is that we now have a decoupling of energy stocks and flows, from material-based stocks and flows to just energy flows. Hydrocarbons are both energy and material stocks. They're really ancient sunlight sequestered carbon. That's very different than primary energy in the form of sun and wind. Renewables, the sun and wind, are pure energy flows. The limit is not how much energy we have. We have plenty of that. The limit is really land and the material resources to capture it. So the 40 gigatons of CO2, that's the mass flow. So we have energy flows and mass flows. That's about 11 gigatons of carbon. Most of it is oxygen. We get the oxygen back out, we put energy in and convert it back. The useful form is from the solar, we convert to electricity and heat, but we still don't have material flows. So I prefer to think about the CO2 problem not as a waste management, but as one of wasted resources. Byproduct of both energy and many of our industrial materials processes is CO2, and we're dumping it in the atmosphere. Circular economy thinking should be no waste, either no byproduct, get all of the material into your final desired product, or if you have a byproduct, use that in a separate industrial process. And that's what we need to try to do. So if we do it and we bury it as waste management, that's pure cost and pure liability. We should try to avoid that. 3,500 gigatons in the atmosphere. That's not waste CO2. Most of that is really good CO2. We remove one CO2, after equilibration, we decrease the atmosphere by a half. we can accept that we have about 1,000 gigatons of CO2. That's 300 gigatons of carbon excess that we can safely mine. That's what we would like to try to do. Mine that CO2, use that as a resource. The problem of separating energy and mass flows is we have no stocks. We need stocks to balance supply and demand, right? Lithium-ion batteries, flow batteries, they'll solve a big part of the problem, not all of the problem. The problem with stocks is there's a time scale. There's a duty cycle. With batteries, we need to be recycling roughly once a day, maybe twice a day, maybe, once every 2 days at best. We need longer term storage for days, weeks, seasonal, this has been said. Hydrogen can get us back to having stocks, but make no mistake, hydrogen is not the perfect fuel. And I think Mary said this, right? But it's not the perfect fuel, but it's very adequate in many circumstances, and we should never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But the gold standard of energy storage is still liquid hydrocarbons. We shouldn't be thinking about just tossing them entirely. They could also have an important role in bridging old to new and smoothing out, taking advantage of their really good properties because they're energy dense by volume. Hydrogen is energy dense by mass, and where mass matters, that's important, but where volume matters, then we start to have a bit of a problem.
That's why we do research.
Yeah. Hydrogen, though, as an energy stock is one thing, but hydrogen is also needed, and renewable hydrogen in ammonia, very important. Right now, 6% natural gas and 2% coal. Hydrogen, a large industry, and I'm going to shut up now. There are many, many applications. Hydrogen, the biggest problem is cost in production, storage, and distribution. We have a lot of end uses. We can do a lot better on the end uses. Fuel cells are already being deployed. I think you mentioned forklifts is the big application. Starting to see them in cars, buses, trucks, UAVs, bicycles, and light aircraft. It's going to be a very, very big industry, but not 100% of the problem.
Well, we're really excited about that. And so to summarize, I think that the key areas that Ellen brought up, there are three main areas, and we're seeing the emergence of a fourth area. So the role of hydrogen in the energy sector can be broken down into various ways, especially renewable hydrogen. And that's, when I say hydrogen, I'm always just thinking renewable hydrogen. I'm the crazy enviro in the crowd here. So I'm not going to chain myself to any trees around here, but we're going to take a line of questioning that's environmentally aggressive here, because that's why we're all here today, right? So the three main areas that we look at for the role of hydrogen in the new energy economy are deep industrial decarbonization, something that's Ellen's spoken a lot about this morning and then in her keynote last night. This would be the potential opportunity to utilize renewable hydrogen in oil refining, which could ultimately reduce the GHG emissions of refineries by up to 45% during the transportation transition while we're weaning off of oil and gas. So the second one would be the transport sector. Obviously, we're going to jump into that a little more, and I'll speak directly to the transport sector this afternoon, or I guess later this morning. Energy storage, which Ellen spoke about, we're going to jump a little further into there. And then disaster resilience is a really interesting new area that I think hydrogen will play a major role in. So we'll come back to those topics, but just keep in mind, those are the four high-level topics that we'll be looking at for the role of hydrogen in the new energy economy. And so let's dive right in. So Mary Rose, I had a lot of questions for you that you actually just answered in your keynote. So I think you were reading off of my notes ahead of the keynote. But that said, we could jump into a couple of areas specifically. So can you give us a little background on the evolution of the hydrogen program at IEA? What brought you to this point? And I should give some background. I was at the Hydrogen Council G20 Summit where IEA actually initially presented the report. So I read the report from cover to cover. I was very impressed with it. It was very high level. I think there are a lot of deep dives, a lot of rooms for additional research, which you just mentioned when Ellen was speaking. So if you could give us just a maybe 1 minute primer on the evolution of the program, And then I'd like to dive a little into the role of the policy community as you see it.
Thank you for that question. The IEA, as I told you, was set up to do fossil work. And the guy who's the executive director right now, he's a world-class analyst, and he's been decorated many times for his accuracy and his forecasts on the fossil fuel supply. And while he was at the IEA, along came renewables, and the IEA kind of bypassed them. And then the UN said, wait a minute, we need a program on renewables. So now we have an organization called IRENA. That's the International Renewable Energy Group, and this is a UN body. And so the IEA took note that renewables were here and arrived, and they've integrated them into the IEA program in the bureaucracy in Paris and headquarters. And they have now come to note that hydrogen is perhaps going to be the future, and in many ways. So that's how that evolved. And the group that I manage, we do our own R&D work, and we do our own analysis work, but the IEA has tremendous convening power, and reports that come from the IEA get the world's attention. And so Japan funded this. They launched it. They invested in the IEA to publish this report. So that's how that happened. And I would just like to make another comment here that this is something that really I think we have to keep in mind. Energy is not like IT. You cannot sell the beta version of a gizmo, or you might, but you could be very sorry if you did it. And the market, it might never actually ultimately sell, and you might be stuck with a lemon. But this is a long-term transition that we're engaged in. The Germans have a name for it. They call it the Energiewende, the energy change. And so, I don't mean to be discouraging, but this is realistic. And anybody here remember a guy named Jimmy Carter? Remember what he said when he said at the end, energy independence is the moral equivalent of war? When did he say that? What was it, like 1976? So, since then, we do have renewables, and we're making progress. But make no mistake, this is a long-term play. The other thing that I would just like to re-emphasize, because I did say this before, but the energy industry 30 years ago, the utilities, the autos, and the oil and gas companies themselves, they had a full panoply of strategies that they could deploy to sweep renewables away. But now, as we know, these companies are now beginning to think, okay, we have to reposition ourselves, and guess what? We're going to ally with hydrogen. So we're making progress. Don't be discouraged, but do be mindful that this is a long-term play.
Okay. Go ahead, sir. All right. So I'm glad you brought in the fact that the Japanese government commissioned a report. There's a huge push in Japan right now for an energy transition post Fukushima. They're focusing highly on hydrogen, and they're highlighting the hydrogen society in the context of the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games next summer. So hydrogen really is having its moment right now. And to that extent, Japan and Australia are strongly linked on this, because Japan is resource constrained. It's an island nation. They just simply don't have the resources, especially on the renewable side, for production. So they're looking at Australia as a net energy exporter, specifically for hydrogen or ammonia. Andrew, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that, because you mentioned some stats yesterday about the number of coal-fired plants that are popping up in Japan. So we hear this kind of clean energy transition from Japan. Meanwhile, they're building dozens of coal-fired plants. And just prior to attending the G20 event where IEA announced the report or presented the report, I attended an F20 summit for the foundations and environmental community. And I was shocked after following along for the last year or so with Japan's efforts in the hydrogen area that the environmental community just wasn't buying it. They look at it much like the environmental community here in the United States as a Trojan horse for natural gas and coal. They specifically looked at the relationship with Australia as just importing fossil-based hydrogen into Japan. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I'd love to hear how Star Scientific plans to approach that, and then I'll follow up with another question if you could speak to
Sure,
it,
I
please.
kind of feel like the cork of thorny here. So what we're listening to is science, and we're listening to the IEA, which is as you said, is the political base. And I met with Timur Gul while I was over in Paris, and we discussed that at length. Australia has signed an agreement with Japan at the moment, and there's a $500 million program to look at turning brown coal into hydrogen. And frankly, we're all laughing at it. What I can tell you is that you've got a situation where you have science and you have the big organisations such as the IEA, but then you have the global corporations, and they've completely walked away from that. They have all, the more you talk to these guys, these big energy players, they're just looking at you going, no, we've already made the decision to go hydrogen. There's a very good example in Australia at the moment. There are two energy plants that have been approved. One's in the Northern Territory, 10 gigawatt plant that has a DC cable that's supposed to run to Singapore. Sort of problematic, but it's possible. Running a DC cable is about 3% loss compared to 40%. But there was another one, a 15 gigawatt co-wind and solar plant that was due to be built in Western Australia in a place called the Pilbara. Now that, all of a sudden, its funding got pulled by the major investors, and they went, you know what, no cable. Forget the cable, we're going hydrogen. And Macquarie was the big driver in that. And Macquarie and us, we've had quite a few conversations. In fact, one of their people at the moment is trying to join our company. It's been quite interesting talking around the world to these big investment groups. The big investment groups have walked away from batteries. They've walked away from solar. They have walked away from wind. And it's really interesting to hear these guys, these heavyweight guys. They are now saying, listen, we now believe that green hydrogen is possible. Companies like Engie basically picked up their entire coal fleet, sold it to Total, and now they're just headlined into hydrogen. We met with them in Paris. They're just into hydrogen. And when you say, listen, can you supply gigatons? They go, give us a couple of years. Yeah.
So, that brings up my next question. You're in a unique position because, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, Star Scientific plans to essentially license the equipment, and you're essentially, profiting or making money from the steam itself. It's not from the sales of the
That's right.
equipment.
No, we're not selling the units. We're not licensing them. We're running them.
So that would be analogous to the automotive OEMs selling or leasing vehicles on a per mile basis, right? So if that's the case, and you're actually at that point an operator of the unit, you should have direct control over the feedstock coming in.
That's right. That's one of the reasons we've done it. There are a number of income streams for us in that. We're also building a finance organisation around that, a sort of a hydrogen-based finance organisation that's within our company. We've just, in fact, selected the CEO, a wonderful lady who's going to be working out of Zurich. So we're moving to look at it. We realised that when we started to do this, we realised very, very quickly we had to build a corporate structure that was going to be able to fund new hydrogen infrastructure, new hydrogen inventions, get away possibly from solar and wind-driven electrolyzers. There are so many things coming out of Australia, Europe, and in America. As I said, I can't tell you who, but I'm going to go see a very interesting technology in Utah straight after this. I'm going to fly out there for a day, come back and see this amazing technology that will literally sit next to Hero and operate next to Hero without any electrolyzers and things in the background. But when you talk to the guys about electrolyzers, they're not worried. We've been invited to Siemens into Japan. Our scientists were invited right into the heart of their research. And it was quite a funny conversation. They said, we've got this mammoth electrolyzer and we don't know who can use the hydrogen. And we got our head up and went, we can. And then they said, and we have to clean all this water. And we went, yeah, we make 9 kilos per kilo of hydrogen that we use. And we have to get rid of all this ultra clean water. And we just smiled at each other. Since then, we've started a very strong relationship. Now, they're not going to sell to us. They're going to be selling to the Air Liquids of this world. But yeah, that sort of move forward is very, very rapid in industry. And I understand the IEA is doing a tremendous job at the moment, and that new group they're forming early next year around industry, bringing industry and government and people together. Looking at Japan, Japan we're just starting to talk to now. The wonderful part for Japan and for Planet Power Systems is that a majority of their power stations are new. There's a long lifetime in those turbines. For them to be able to get rid of coal feed and to get rid of pollution control, that's hundreds of millions of dollars a year in their back pocket for each of those power suppliers. So we're not talking to governments, we're talking to those industries. And just like the power station I showed you up there, and that is just a feasibility study. But the first thing they did was, hang on, we don't have to shut in 2032, we don't have to process this muck anymore, because they're the biggest guys. Let me tell you, people demonise power stations, they're the first ones to tell you we don't want to deal with the pollution. So we can make money, we can make more profits, we can stay in business longer, we can keep the turbines turning, we can keep our people employed, and we can expand our business and get our shareholder base back, which is all left because at the moment we're burning carbon. And they just look at you and go, okay, let's see where this is going. And they just bypass government. They go, look, we're going to do this. Just like those solar and wind guys did in Western Australia. The Western Australian government was pushing heavily for the cable. And they just said, look, go away. Not doing that. Hydrogen's the way. You're going to have a video, I think, coming up during the week from a guy called Andrew Twiggy Forrest. Fortescue have already contacted us and spoken to us about Hero. They already move ammonia around between their mines using CSIRO's technology to split back into hydrogen for their iron ore. And they just said to us, listen, we want to start using the excess land around our mines to make hydrogen, but we now want to create a complete Australia-wide ammonia network to the point that they're sponsoring the Newcastle ports, which is where all the coal goes out of. Newcastle Port is now converting 2 of their docks to ammonia. And Fortescue are now actively buying up LNG ships to change them to ammonia ships.
So
it's started. It's already started.
To build on that and to really kind of jump into the weeds, and I just want to take a minute to address this. So with your position as controlling the inputs there and the comments you made on the future of hydrogen in Australia, can you tell us specifically what Star Scientific's commitment is to renewable hydrogen as a feedstock for the Hero technology?
Look, it's absolute, but in the early days, we would probably have to accept at least some blue hydrogen in there. We're not going to be able to roll out, and you're quite correct, both of you, we're not going to be able to roll out that quickly. But it is interesting when you talk to people like Onji, and I spoke to Air Liquid at length as well. They're just going, listen, this is just a matter of, give us the time. We've got the gears. And certainly in Australia, I mean, Australia is the same continental landmass as the US, and there's 25 million of us. So there's a lot of space in the middle there that's always sunny.
Sure.
We're just a great country for that. So, and it's all flat. So there is definitely, an opportunity there. There's definitely an opportunity there to go green. No one is telling us, and Onji surprised us because they were the ones going, we're in, we're going to be making so much hydrogen. Let's start a relationship. Let's start having that conversation.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, we were saying, but making hydrogen has to be from carbon-free energy.
Absolutely.
No solar and wind, so I.
Oh no! But there are But there's new technologies, and a lot of them are catalytic.
Catalytic or not, you still need a source of energy.
That's right. But there's an interesting catalyst being developed by the Uni of New South Wales in linking with the Uni of Queensland and Monash. And that's a very interesting process, that one. So there are new technologies. Right now, the only market activator at the moment people talk about are vehicles, or putting a bit of gas into the gas pipeline as number 2 is on the statement of the paper from the IEA. Let's put gas into pipelines, we need a market activator. That plant at Eraring, 200 tonnes an hour of hydrogen it's going to need with Hero. So if you look at that, that's what we're looking at. We're the market activators that are going to go out there. And we started talking to these big companies going, we've got our technology, it's proven it's ready to run. We're going to be rolling out our test turbines shortly. We need the hydrogen.
Sure, absolutely. So on that note, the Hydrogen Council has made a commitment to 100% renewable or decarbonized, which is a ongoing argument over, what do we mean by decarbonized? What are the implications of CCS? Hopefully we'll have a little time to jump into that. Their commitment is by 2030 to be 100% decarbonized. I believe that's just for the transport sector. The state of California has now a law on the books will be 100% renewable by 2040. Many of the companies like Air Liquide have made these commitments or signed on to these commitments. I'm going to put you on the spot now. Is your company committed to utilizing 100% renewable or decarbonized?
Oh, no, absolutely. What we're saying is in the very early days, very early days, ourselves, we might still need to use regular hydrogen.
Sure, I mean the skills.
But when we're setting up a plant, no, we've absolutely made the commitment. And, my shareholders would kill me if we didn't. We have a very unique shareholder base. And they've made it very, very clear to us that, listen, we're going to go down this road, this is how we go down the road.
Can you provide a timeline?
Look, we're looking, obviously, by 2025, we hope to be in a number of plants. Hero is not a difficult thing to build, surprisingly. It's just not that hard to build. My scientist will kill me at home for saying that, but it's not that hard to build. The rollout we want to do, initially say in Oraring, what we would do is put in 100 megawatt boosters and start off that way to decarbonise that plant. And that's an unusual plant. I mean, to give people an example of the size, each of those boilers is 15 metres taller than a Saturn V rocket. So they are not, this is not a baby plant. But there are lots of them around. And in this room, I've been handed cards from people saying, can you come to this state? And I've had emails from other states while I've been here going, you need to pop down and see us because we had a couple of power stations we really don't want to close. So this is an economic driver, you know, and so that commitment has to go along with that. And that's what we've stood for all along. So unless we can make that commitment that we're going to go 100% green, it's not much point for them to change over. So yes, we are.
So just to be clear, you have made the commitment to go
Oh,
100%
absolutely.
green.
Absolutely.
Okay,
To
all right,
the
good.
shareholders, to our government.
It's okay to say no because I know this isn't an easy process, and it's my job as kind of the hippie in me to press Andy on this. But it is not. It is absolutely not an easy thing to do, especially at scale. So we'll dive into that a little bit. Actually, let's just dive into it right now. So Mary Rose, you spoke about sector coupling, and I'd like to ask you some questions about essentially the role of curtailment, energy storage, using curtailed renewables to produce hydrogen. How do you see that playing into sector decoupling, whether it's for stationary power generation, for transport, for deep industrial decarbonization? What's your outlook on that?
I mean, the future is bright, but it took a long time to focus people's attention on the idea that, oh yes, you could actually get to a point where you have so much installed renewable energy capacity that the grid cannot take it up. Okay, so it took a long time to get there, and about 4 years ago I read a report of a CEO in Europe, and he just said, well, we're very late to the party. We're very late in adding renewables to our strategy. We don't know if we're going to be able to keep up. And this is a very different story over there than it is here. But the truth is that in many places they have to curtail the uptake of the power. And so right now, the idea that you have the possibility to store the hydrogen somewhere means you can keep producing, and then you electrolyze it and store it. And then this gives you the opportunity then to use it when you need it, wherever you need it. And it's not just the curtailment, it's also the fact that the price has, we have come down the price curve, as the economists say. And I would just like to make one statement here about one of the reasons why we have come down the price curve in renewables. China, remember China? Okay. When China decides to do something, and you mentioned policies, China just does it. It's by fiat, it's a mandate. They don't have any of these fancy legal regulatory frameworks that we've got that involve all kinds of public comment periods, They just do it, okay? And they did it for renewable energy, and the price for photovoltaics, it went below the cost of production, which caused a great disruption and dislocation in the industry. But it enabled the use of renewable energy in a broader, if you were in the business, it could have been a little disastrous, but it enabled the use of renewable energy, okay? And so now we're in a good place now. And I think it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen everywhere in the same way. Because everywhere on Earth has got some resources to make hydrogen, but they're not always the same. And the demands are different. The geographic and the climatic conditions are different. The business propositions for every, the geopolitics are quite different. So it's going to vary, but there's already, a huge momentum in the UK and in Norway, which is a big producer of oil and gas, and Germany. So we've got the North Sea cluster. We've got Argentina all ready to produce hydrogen and ship it, just like Australia is getting ready to ship it. So a lot of the basic building blocks are there, policy-wise.
Well, I'm glad you spoke a little bit to the curtailment issue, and let's provide some numbers around that we can associate here in the United States right now. So California has a commitment to 100% renewable energy by 2040, which is aggressive, right? So our legislature, everyone's in favor of this. Who wouldn't be in favor of that, at least in California, right? So I don't think they quite understood what it would take to get to 100% renewable, right? So if we were just isolating solar, because that's the primary renewable input in our energy system, then wind, and then some geothermal after that, right? If we're producing solar in a very sunny state, I should say, so this isn't necessarily applicable to the rest of the country, but it will speak to the energy storage demands for the rest of the country. very simply put, if we have an 8-hour solar production period, we need to be producing about 3 times the amount of solar we need during that 8-hour period, and then storing the rest so that we can keep cities the size of Los Angeles and San Francisco running overnight. That is no easy task, and that is a huge amount of energy that we're going to have to store. Ellen spoke a little bit to the technologies that we would use to store that last night. We'll dive into that in a second. So right now we're at a 34% renewable mix in California. And every year during the spring when the weather isn't too hot, we have been breaking the records from the year before, the curtailment records, right? So there was one day in April, and it's not the only day, but one day in April this year, we curtailed 10.5 gigawatts of renewable electricity that we either had to just completely dispose of or pay other markets to take it off of our hands. To put that in perspective, 10.5 gigawatts is enough to fuel about 350,000 fuel cell electric vehicles for that day. And that's just energy that we're wasting. So as we add to the renewable mix, as we get from 34% to 100%, that delta, that additional 66%, that's going to be completely wasted. All of that energy will be wasted, aside from what we'll be consuming with the additional grid strain from battery electric vehicles. So every incremental percentage point that we add to the renewable mix in California, during these mild days, we're going to be wasting that unless we can find a storage mechanism that would enable us to either send that to transport or to return it to the grid. And it's programs like the LCFS program that will make it valuable enough to store that and then send it back into the transport sector. So to bring back on topic here, as Mary Rose was talking about the renewable production technologies, and Andrew mentioned this as well, there are a lot of emerging technologies that are promising. But right now, in the context of renewable hydrogen production, we're speaking primarily about the use of renewable electricity production to electrolyze water and separate hydrogen from oxygen and capture hydrogen in that capacity. Or we're talking about the separation of renewable gas, methane, right? And that's a very complicated topic as well, because you need the feedstocks, right? Agricultural bio-waste, wastewater treatment plants. There are several feedstocks that will permit us to convert these, otherwise methane producers into renewable gas and then separate the carbon from the hydrogen there. Now, while that has the biggest environmental impact, because methane is somewhere, and you guys please correct me, somewhere around 30 times more impactful as a GHG. 21? Okay, yeah, I hear different numbers.
Yeah, because it depends on the time scale.
So if you look at the carbon intensity of renewable hydrogen and use for transport in California, we'll be at zero if you just use solar to produce hydrogen, you put that in a fuel cell vehicle and use it. Zero carbon intensity, it's a zero emission vehicle. If you use dairy biogas that otherwise would be just escaped into the atmosphere, the carbon intensity of that is negative 270. That produces about an $8 per kilogram, or a gasoline gallon equivalent, LCFS credit in California. That is an extremely renewable resource. Extremely valuable resource. But the stats are, if we convert every single feedstock in the state of California to create biogas, we'd probably come up with about 16% of the state's need for gas. So my point here is that we're going to have to be looking very strongly at renewable electricity for electrolysis, and then some of the breakout technologies that Andrew was speaking of. So I want to change gears a little bit and ask Ellen a couple of questions. I know she spent some time at DOE under Secretary Chu and Secretary Muniz. Secretary Chu came out very strongly against hydrogen back around 2008 timeframe, and he's
he was under the
Yeah, so he's since changed gears. He changed his mind and publicly came out and said I was wrong. What was the atmosphere in the DOE relative to hydrogen during that time frame, and how have you seen that evolve?
So thank you for the
The
question.
4 miracles occurred, that's the bottom line. He said it would take 4 miracles, right?
Well, actually, that's what we said at Ford originally. When Ford and BP were talking about a hydrogen economy back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we looked at it from Ford and said it would take 4 miracles. You can do 1 miracle, you can do 2 miracles, but 4 miracles is going to take a while at a minimum. Well, you're right.
Yeah.
We now kind of have those 4 miracles. But yes, Chu was anti-hydrogen for some of these reasons. Worried about storage, distribution, chicken and egg. It isn't the perfect fuel. He was more behind making fuels from sunlight and going all the way to hydrocarbons. He did try to kill the hydrogen program, and Congress saved it, interesting enough. But the hydrogen program in the US has still never been that large.
Right, no.
And there's been, but there is an ongoing hydrogen program to this day. US, as I understand, pulled out of the implementing
Yes, they did.
agreement in hydrogen.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. But
And Canada.
US is involved in the IEA Solar Paces, which is to make, has a big component of making hydrogen from the sun, but without electricity. So to Andrew's point and to your point, there are a lot of ways we can make hydrogen renewably, absolutely, and they don't have to be from electricity. And there are a lot of ways to make hydrogen from electricity that isn't necessarily electrolyzer. The thing about electrolysis is, number one, it's commercialized, and it is the front runner in terms of getting into the market. And so it's on its learning curve and starting to scale up. And it has some other ancillary benefits of being able to provide other grid services and make hydrogen deal with the curtailment. The curtailment issue, as I understand, in California is like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the policy says they can't curtail, and that's part of why they're paying Arizona to take the electric. The other problem that at least Arizona's looking at is taking electrons from California and also keeping their nuclear plant alive. So everybody is starting to really look at hydrogen as that balancing agent.
Absolutely.
And not just to store it and remake electricity, power to gas, get it into the natural gas, start to green natural gas, get it into ammonia plants, because we say the CO2 footprint in ammonia, and we don't feed the world without it, is huge. And ammonia can be an energy vector for transportation of hydrogen. A lot of people are looking at the distribution of hydrogen.
Sure.
Starts to cross sectors. And it's a redesign of the system to get it back into balance of supply and demand, and to, as you mentioned, deeply decarbonize all of the sectors.
Sure.
Not just electricity. And just one last point to your factor of 3, generally speaking, the loads overnight are lower than during the day, so at least in the sunny states, actually load follows a little bit closer to the sun.
Sure.
And you also have wind at night. So it's more getting the supply and the demand loaded in balance.
Well, unless we want to plug in 30 million battery electric vehicles
Which-
overnight in California, right?
Maybe.
I mean, there are some...
There's a lot of other issues with doing that.
Absolutely. And so let's dive into that a little bit. And just before I do, let's talk about the evolution of the DOE, the current federal administration's view on hydrogen over the last couple of years, right? So when the new administration came in 2016, DOE was freaking out, right? We had a brain drain of some of the best scientists in the country, just saw the writing on the wall. EERE budgets were cut dramatically. We lost a lot of talent in the DOE. I mean, talent that we won't be able to replace. It'll set us back decades. The interesting thing, though, is that of all the EERE programs that were cut, hydrogen got a boost, a net boost. I think it was 37% in their budget the first year after the new administration came in. And I think this speaks directly to transport and to oil and gas. So Ellen has spoken about the various industries that play a role in deep industrial decarbonization. The primary one in the United States is oil refining, the gasoline. They produce more hydrogen than any other industrial producer in the United States, at least, right? And most of this is coming from Texas, right? So there's more hydrogen produced in Texas than any other state, maybe every other state in the country. There are more hydrogen pipelines. There are more natural storage caverns.
Fly to that.
Absolutely.
Went by very fast.
And it's the cheapest renewable electricity in the state. So, ironically, this could be the grail. Texas should be the ground. It shouldn't necessarily be California leading the way on this.
Yeah, and they have the ports.
They absolutely have the ports. So I think the new administration has seen this opportunity. I think the oil and gas companies see that the writing's on the wall for transportation electrification, right? If it goes all battery electric, and I'm going to speak to this in just a second, if it goes all battery electric, the oil and gas companies are out of business. But they are already the largest producers of hydrogen in the United States. This is the future of their business. This is the evolution of their business. It's my job to make sure it's renewable hydrogen, which it's not right now, and there's a path to that, but oil and gas has a huge role to play in this, and we can turn those guys from, kind of the Mr. Burns of the environmental space to the heroes. Absolutely. So to speak just a little bit to transportation, there are only two tools in the ZEV toolbox. There are battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. And as Americans, we want to pick winners. We just want to say, I'm gambling on this horse, I know it's going to win, and nothing else matters. So I hear this debate between battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles, much like the VHS Betamax wars of the 80s, right? The fact of the matter is that we absolutely cannot fill all roles necessary in transportation with battery electric vehicles. So I'm going to put that into scale for just a second, and then we'll come back to the readers here. So the twin ports of Long Beach and San Pedro account for about 30% of all goods imported by ship into the United States of America, into one port. There are 17,000 heavy-duty vehicles at the twin ports, right? Elon Musk would have us think that those are all going to be battery electric heavy-duty trucks that will take 8 to 12 hours to charge. So can you imagine, just maybe close your eyes for a second and picture 17,000 heavy-duty trucks lined up next to each other, out of service for 8 to 12 hours to recharge. Having to change out the batteries every few years, having a range of maybe 200 miles, there's absolutely no way that can work. Frankly, it's very reckless for Elon to suggest otherwise. The air quality in those communities is atrocious. There are 70 to 90% asthma rates in the schools around those communities. People will die if we prolong the adoption of fuel cell electric vehicles in the heavy duty space. Now, I'll dive into the differentiation between heavy and light duty in just a couple of minutes. I think Mary might want to add to that point, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Yes, absolutely. Listen, this country should be very grateful to California because they're our bellwether. I mean, they set the mores and the pace, and I've been observing them for a long time, and it's been a lot of hard work. It isn't just magic. But I would also like to say that the fact that that unlikely candidates have actually been proponents of hydrogen. For example, there was a president who was an oil man, like at the beginning of the decade. He gave the hydrogen program at DOE the biggest boost that it had anywhere. And the money went to all the labs. I mean, I can say this because I came from one of the labs. So, and so you never know where your support is going to come. But then the third point is really about marketing. This overused example of the VCR and the Betamax, it just shows you that, the good things do happen in politics. You can't always predict where they're going to come from. California is going to stand as steadfast as it can. But we have got to do our own marketing. You cannot relax. Because if you relax, you don't know what you're going to get. Somebody else's geopolitical or business interest will dictate what we get. So for those of you in the environmental community, be encouraged. And for those of you who live out west, it would be a lot easier to refuel your hydrogen vehicle, at a gas station that operates just like the conventional ones do now. One of my friends from Santa Fe was saying to me just the other day, because he's got a home in LA, he says, I want to drive back and forth and I do it on a hydrogen vehicle in a flash, but there aren't any.
We're getting there. I'm going to do something about that, and I'll mention it at 11. So we only have about a minute and a half left. I did want to mention, to build on Mary's point, that the Hydrogen Highway Initiative was adopted in California under a Republican governor. Environmental issues are not political issues in California, and I think that's the point we need to get to in this country. 30 seconds, Andrew, if you could sum up, what would be the most impactful, top of your wish list, if you could have it in the next couple of years, that would impact your space and the hydrogen space overall? Can you give us a 30-second primer on what your top
Two things we're going to drive for is as many power plants we can flip as possible, and rolling out the supercritical CO2 systems. The second big one is desalination.
Okay.
Feel the water is the next big problem.
Great. And I'd like to finish with Ellen. What's your wish? Give us your top wish and the most impactful area that you think renewable hydrogen will have an impact on.
Renewable hydrogen production, get on the learning curve, drive down the costs, and then solve the issue of the best way to distribute hydrogen, whether it's through the gas pipeline, through liquid hydrogen, compressed hydrogen, or as ammonia, or as liquid organic carriers. We need to solve that problem as well, so that it's cost effective to distribute it around the world.
Well said. It has to be renewable.
And it has
Otherwise,
to be
doesn't work.
renewable.
It absolutely has to be renewable. So thank you for your time. I'll be back up on stage at 11. You can throw rotten fruit at me or ask questions, whatever you'd like. I'll dive a little more into our plans in California, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.